Hello, and welcome to another edition of the new Character Matters program. I'm Dr. George Simon, and today we're going to be continuing the discussion that we've been having the past few times on gratitude and the obstacles to gratitude, the benefits of gratitude. And today, especially, we're going to be focusing on the type of chronic ingratitude that can lead to a phenomenon known as bitterness. As you may know, we've been exploring some topics that I am currently producing a book about, namely what I call the 10 Commandments of Good Character. And we have already explored the issues related to egocentricity and overcoming our inherent egocentricity, realizing that we are all connected, that we and everything else that exists is connected in very sophisticated ways. And it behooves us to understand our place and the many ways in which we are connected so that we can take an appropriate place and be a part of the solution instead of a part of the problem with respect to many of our concerns. And the second commandment, uh, having to do with overcoming a sense of entitlement, has been what we've been talking about over the last few episodes. Coming to realize that there are no real entitlements in life, that life itself is a totally unearned gift, and it behooves us to be grateful for this gift, even though there are many reasons why folks feel uh, unobliged to be grateful. There are many reasons in this broken, sometimes hostile, sometimes cruel, and certainly unjust world where it can seem like we have little reason, little cause to be grateful. And some folks struggle with this for most of their lives. They come to life bitterly disappointed and with some unmet expectation. So, we're going to talk about that in more depth today about how bitterness arises, how it has its origins in a lack of perceived cause for gratitude, and the toll that it takes, not only on relationships, but the toll that it takes on an individual's emotional, psychological, and especially spiritual well being. Bitter people are not pleasant to be around. It's difficult to relate to them in healthy ways. Sometimes it seems like you can never quite please them. And this, of course, takes its toll. But it's also really toxic for the bitter person. A bitter person can't seem to find the joy in life. And one wonders sometimes why such an attitude can persist. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. Now, bitterness is a kind of chronic ingratitude that develops insidiously, slowly, incrementally, many times. But once it sets in, it's almost impossible to root out. A bitter person maintains a dour sentiment and frame of mind that permeates almost every aspect of their lives. Now, bitterness stems from the person perceiving that they've been denied something, that they are owed. And that makes it very difficult to overcome any sense of entitlement. Folks who are bitter are stuck in their attempts to move past the lessons of the first commandment that we've talked about, which is about overcoming our inherent egocentricity, our natural egocentricity, and feeling a part of something bigger. It develops kind of insidiously, and it can arise in one of two ways. Either the person from the beginning feels that they didn't get their fair share in life. They look around them, they see others having so much more, and they feel like they were somehow cheated, that they were denied various things that they perceive others were given. And with a sense of expectation and some sense of entitlement, and with a particular degree of envy for what others have that they perceive they don't have, they can develop a chronic sense of ingratitude about their circumstances. And the other way that this can arise is when something is taken away, when a person suffers a significant loss, and where they feel unjustly and unfairly cheated out of something that they were attached to. Maybe it could be the loss of a loved one. Maybe it can be the unexpected loss of wealth or something else, where a person's circumstances drastically change. Life was going along just fine, and then something horrible happened. And the person hasn't figured out just how to deal with that, especially because in some way they felt entitled to what they had. They didn't regard it as a free and perishable gift. Nothing, nothing in this life lasts. Nothing in this life lasts. The only thing that can endure, the only thing that is eternal, so to speak, was there in the beginning and will be there at the end, is the love that brings all things into existence. But bitter folks have a hard time seeing that. So if they have been deprived or perceive they have been deprived, they can develop this chronic sense of ingratitude that we call bitterness. And if something is taken away, they lose something that they've been attached to that's important to them and that they feel they deserve, they can develop that ingratitude that easily turns to bitterness. Now, the word bitterness comes from, it has a Greek derivation, and it means sharp. And as anyone who's dealt with a bitter person knows, the so-called sharp tongue remarks that they make can really cut, because the bitter person is really angry about what they feel they have been denied, and they don't mind letting others know about it. They want the whole world to know how cheated they feel. And they would like others to feel sorry for them and tend to their needs. The problem is that the way the bitter person goes about it only alienates others. Their sarcastic and cryptic comments turn others off. And the very comfort that they seek is denied them by their own actions. They don't see it, however, because they're too wrapped up in their bitterness. And that's something I'd like to talk about a little bit more. It's interesting how folks hold on to these negative feelings when they're bitter. You know, it's one thing to be relatively ungrateful when things don't quite go the way you'd like them to. You have high expectation, and then you experience disappointment. When you experience those disappointment, there's a bit of spiritual desolation that occurs. Expectation, of course, is the breeding ground for any kind of spiritual desolation. So you have high expectation, you get disappointed, and you feel kind of down in the dumps about it. You may even get on your pity pot. But some folks especially chronically ungrateful, bitter folks, seem to hang on to their dour sentiment about life. And it doesn't make any rational sense because it only alienates people and it doesn't really feel particularly good. So, why then would a person do that? What sense does it make to hang on to ill feelings and to be bitter about what you perceive that life has denied you or that life has taken away from you that you valued? What good does it do? What benefit, what reward is there for you in hanging on to those ill feelings? We know from behavioral science that ultimately people do the things that they experience some benefit from, and they avoid the things that cost them or cause them pain. So, why would anyone hang on to the ill feelings that accompany bitterness? I'm reminded of a poem by Stephen Crane that I heard early in my life as a professional, and that really, I think, speaks to this issue in a way. And I wonder if the author didn't have all of this in mind when he penned these famous words. In the desert, I saw a creature, naked, bestial, who, squatting upon the ground, held his heart in his hands and ate of it. I said, "Is it good, friend?" "It is bitter, bitter," he answered, "but I like it because it is bitter and because it is my heart." This is what I've come to know about bitterness from my clinical experience. Bitterness gives the chronically ungrateful person a sense of power and control over their circumstance. It certainly gives them a sense of power and control over their sentiments. You know, the sentiment of being deprived, especially when you're younger, of having been cheated somehow in life, is not a pleasant sentiment to bear. Similarly, the sentiment of having something snatched from you that you were attached to, someone perhaps you were very fond of, that you loved very deeply, and then you lost them. These feelings are painful, but you're not in control. Things happen, whether you're born into circumstances where you experience relative deprivation, or whether you're suffering an unexpected and unplanned loss. You're not in control. So hanging on to these feelings and not allowing yourself the other feelings, the other more positive feelings that could be snatched away, gives you a sense of control. No one can release the bitterness but the bitter person, and they know that very deeply. So, in a very strange way, the person who either feels denied something or has lost something has perfect control over possessing something that only they can release. And so they keep company with their bitterness. They have a constant, albeit pathetic and toxic, friend in their bitterness. A something, a reality that can't be snatched until they decide to release it. And should they decide to release it, they're vulnerable again. They're vulnerable to hurt and disappointment. So many bitter folks would prefer the constant, irrevocable company of their bitterness then the potential pain of vulnerability and future loss and future disappointment. It doesn't seem to make sense at first, but it actually makes perfect sense at an emotional level. So when you're trying to deal with the bitter person, when you're trying to invite them to step out of their morbid mindset and step into life again, you have to appreciate what you're really asking them to do. You're asking them to open themselves up to vulnerability, to potential disappointment, which is what they've been at odds with in the first place, and to potential loss, which they may fear a great deal. So it's a very tender enterprise, to lovingly confront and deal with the bitter person. So one of the things that I advise individuals who have been dealing with a bitter family member, relationship partner, friend, or acquaintance, one of the things that I advise is to be particularly tender in approaching these folks. If you're going to courageously embark on a conversation about bitterness, and to be sure that you don't make it personal. It's not particularly effective to confront the person's irrationality or the senselessness of their bitterness. As we've just talked about, it actually does make sense that the person who feels either denied in the first place or deeply disappointed wants to hang on to something that only they can release, and also experiences the dilemma of knowing that they invite their own vulnerability to future disappointment and maybe even to future loss if they do open themselves up and try to reclaim some joy in life. So, what the person who is bitter needs, if you're going to confront them, is understanding. And what needs to be confronted more than anything else is the bitterness, the behavior that accompanies bitterness, the sharp tongue remarks, all of the things that are ultimately self defeating. If you make it about the bitterness itself and the behaviors surrounding the bitterness, and not about the person or the legitimate reasons why they have the bitterness, you are more likely to make some headway. And this is important. If you're going to be a real friend to someone who's struggling with bitterness, in the end, however, only the bitter person themselves can put an end to their dilemma. And they have to find room in their heart for first embracing the first commandment, that ultimately it's not all about them. They have to get outside of the inordinate self-focus that keeps them stuck. And then they also have to reckon with this whole sense of entitlement that is so heavily reinforced in our culture these days. Life itself is precious enough, but we don't see it that way. And there's a big reason, and we're going to talk about this in future episodes a lot, because this is perhaps the greatest insight that psychology and healthy spirituality can come together on and see in many different ways, but nonetheless, it's the most profound reality. At the root of this dilemma is the fact that we are so aligned from the beginning with what Freud called the pleasure principle that we can't embrace life. From the very first moments of our existence, we are actually afraid of this enterprise called life until we get our first taste of pleasure or comfort. And then when we secure enough of that pleasure and comfort, we begin to relish this enterprise. And we live in that fear of death or the loss of pleasure until we experience pain that seems too great to bear. Then we want out. Then we don't even want to live anymore. So within us are these two forces, very strong forces that rage from the beginning: the pleasure seeking principle and the life principle. And we, to start with, are solidly, almost irrevocably allied with the pleasure principle. It drives everything. And because it does, it deprives us of really living, really embracing life, eternal, timeless bliss. We'll have much more to say about that in a few future episodes. That's way down the path of spiritual evolution that the commandments that I've been talking about are meant to help us cultivate, and that I've been addressing in my most recent literary enterprise. As most of you know, I have 4 books out currently: In Sheep's Clothing, Understanding and Dealing with Manipulative People. This is the international bestseller that first described what most people call these days the gaslighting effect. That crazy making feeling when you just know that somebody you're involved with has got some real issues, but somehow every time you confront them, they have you thinking there's something wrong with you. So this was the book that explained how these professional impression managers and manipulators make you feel crazy for suspecting that there's something wrong with them, how to confront and understand their tactics, how to respond to them, and how to become much more empowered in your life. So that's what my book In Sheep's Clothing is all about. Then there is my book, Character Disturbance, The Phenomenon of Our Age, so titled because character dysfunction is the phenomenon of our age. And in my book, I talk about all of the various types of character disturbances and disorders there are, how to recognize the signs, how to empower yourself in relationships, how to do adequate character vetting, and most importantly, perhaps, how to find the right kind of help. Because these days, all too many folks dealing with character disturbance experience what we call therapy-induced trauma, being further traumatized by their experience trying to get some help, going for help, but feeling worse instead of better as a result of the experience. And then my book, How Did We End Up Here? The Toxic Relationship Survivors Survival Guide, how to navigate this crazy mixed up world of ours, how to pick up the pieces and move on after a toxic relationship, how to empower yourself and avoid similar pitfalls in the future, understanding better how you got where you got and making sure that you have your eyes wide open the next time around. And then my book for the Christian faith community, The Judas Syndrome, about how genuine faith can truly help nurture and save a soul. And my current book, Under Development, and almost there, I'm pretty sure we are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel now. A book that was originally written in a more moralistic sense, but now incorporates all aspects of the human being, a more holistic approach to being as healthy as we can be emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. originally titled The 10 Commandments of Character, which I first outlined in my book, Character Disturbance. So if you want to get a preview, you can check that out in my book, Character Disturbance. But this next book is a much more in-depth discussion, especially about the spiritual ramifications of mastering these important life lessons that sages throughout the ages have told us are so important for personal growth, for our emotional health, for our psychological health, and especially our spiritual health. And as I mentioned earlier, I think we're almost at the point where I think we're ready for final edits and publication. We're very close. We're not quite there yet, but I'll be having some announcements about that pretty soon. I'll also be having some announcements about the next live edition of this program. The next live edition will be a YouTube live event, not a Facebook live event. Had too many complaints about streaming interruptions and streaming difficulties with that event to use that platform again. And all of these initial broadcasts, live broadcasts, are being done experimentally. We're also going to have a Zoom event. We'll have several different platforms before we're ready to go on our own network. We're not quite ready with that. We've got a lot of professionalizing to do in that respect, but very soon we will have some news about how Character Matters will be brought to you. And on the next edition of the new Character Matters, we're going to be moving in to what I call the third commandment of sound character development. And it has to do with a balanced sense of self and sense of self-worth. We're going to be spending a lot of time there because this is a pivotal commandment for appropriate character development. So as I mentioned, we'll be spending quite a bit of time with it because of its importance. So once again, I'm Dr. George Simon. I thank you for tuning in for this edition, and I hope you'll check out my books readily available on Amazon in different formats, and also check out the blog and the many, many articles on the blog at www.drgeorgesimon.com. That's DRGEORGESIMON.com or manipulative-people.com. Either URL will take you to the same place. And if you want to contact me, either to arrange one of the consultations I offer or to just ask a question or make a comment, you can do that by using the contact feature on the either the consultations page or the Contact Dr. Simon page of the blog. Once again, there are hundreds of articles there that you'll likely find interesting, at least one or two of which will maybe be able to answer some questions about your circumstances and give you some guidance. And in addition to availing yourself of the many services on the blog, I invite you to tune in again next week for another edition of the new Character Matters. I'm Dr. George Simon. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.